Welcome back, listeners, to another episode of Brubacher and Beyond podcast. I'm your host, Sztenderowicz, and we're continuing our discussion on the intricacies of family business. Today we have with us Peter, Henry, and Keith, who will be sharing their insights and experiences. Let's dive right back into this episode. So we're talking a lot about, preparing for this. It's probably the same saying, right? The best day to plant a tree was 10 years ago, making sure. But if you didn't plant that tree, the second best day is today, right? And if you're setting the business up for success, and you're educating and growing the future leadership, what does that look like, Henry? If you had a blank white page, what should that look like in a broad aspect?
Well, I would say the first thing you want to do is to have a father like Peter, to come from a healthy family, but then to do actually what Peter did. Peter managed his own career, right? And I think his father and mother probably had something to do with that, but it sounds like Peter had a pretty clear sense of self and looked around, the world and thought about what he might do. I mean, that's a pretty incredible story of individuation from his parents and yet coming back and following a career path pretty similar. But he's hopefully a lot better than his father because he had the opportunity to stand on his shoulders. So that's something that we encourage families to have family councils where every family member, from little to much bigger, including the adults and the grandparents, to each year talk about their growth plan for the year. So everybody's in this deal, not just people who are in the family enterprise, because Peter, in a way, even though it's not a family firm, it's a professional corporation or partnership, he created another branch or another specialty area that's good for him and good for the firm. And so if you're doing this right, it's really about nurturing people in each of the mountains or each of the teams, the family team, the management team, and the ownership team. And ironically, often there are higher standards for selection of managers than there is for selection of owners, because owners tend to confuse estate planning with business succession. Now, everybody wants to be fair in their estate planning, right? But many times people, and they're guided often by professionals, by accountants and attorneys who are trying to help them to avoid taxes. So all of a sudden, all the kids are in the business now. And so then there are people who are owners, but they're not qualified owners. They're not aligned and committed to be owners. Now, that doesn't happen with good counsel, but it often happens because one of the characteristics of entrepreneurs is that they hate to pay taxes. I mean, I have one client right now in another state who he keeps looking for different accountants so that he has to pay less tax. Well, I mean, being tax efficient is a very important part of a succession plan. I don't take that lightly, but more importantly is, do you have the right people in the right seats? Are these people compatible business partners? And we have found that sibling partnerships are by far the most difficult model of family business ownership. And you can understand why, because siblings have a very sensitive sense of being valued as much as the next one. And if you read the Bible in the New Testament, you'll see this acted out very much. So this is not new. Sibling rivalry probably overstates it a little bit to call it rivalry, but I would call it a sibling sensitivity. And when you start messing around with estates and ownership and jobs, it gets pretty complicated. And many families do not have the communication and conflict resolution skills to deal with those things that are really quite normal. Now, I think Keith has had some interesting challenges in his family. I mean, the Brubacher family
it hasn't been perfect, and some of that learning after the fact instead of ahead of the time, and being maybe less thoughtful about some of those things than we could have been in retrospect, certainly added some complexities, and I'm sure that we're not immune from some in the future as well.
And the senior generation has to keep learning as much as the rising generation. And Keith has been a good example here in that you've had a pretty disciplined professional development plan throughout your career.
Well, I didn't think you gave me a choice those early years when you were the one helping manage it. I don't think I had a choice, but I do appreciate the outcomes, even if I didn't appreciate the process at all times.
But Keith, you are humble, and that's a good thing. But you are very curious about life. Peter is curious. Okay, if people aren't curious, they're not going to do well in business, because whether you're a family member, an owner, a manager, or a board member, you got to have a kind of a radar about what's going on in life, because the business today will not serve the customer of tomorrow. So we've got to have a very friend of mine calls it radar, that everybody's got to be thinking holistically, all around, and looking at demographics, looking at things that we can't control. A lot of things in life, if you're Ukrainian, you can't control a war. There's a lot of things you can control, and that's why I think having the benefit of being a part of a CEO roundtable like Keith has been for many years, so that senior person that Peter talked about earlier cannot hang it up at 50 and say, well, I learned everything I need to learn, because both generations have to keep growing together.
Yeah, and I think one of the things you emphasized many times, that even spouses or siblings or other partners in a business need to continue both growing, and if you grow at different rates for too long, eventually you grow apart, and that can create a challenge. And Peter, I know one of the things we talked about in planning for this was about when things go wrong. So while a good part of your work is on the helping things go right and providing good framework, I know there's a part of your job that unfortunately deals with things that go wrong: dysfunction, disputes, financial hardship, misaligned professional managers, et cetera. And just curious if maybe you'd give us a high-level insight into things that our listeners should understand about those areas in the interest of trying to preempt those before we turn it back to Chris for wrapping up.
Certainly, and I'm happy to share. I would first give the disclaimer that I'm not creating an attorney-client relationship with the listeners, and so this is just general comments and not any specific legal advice. But yes, we have certainly been in contexts that are less than ideal. For example, we have done planning for succession planning when a founding owner or a 100% owner is already in hospice, and now we have to make a plan that will survive that person's untimely death. So these are not ideal circumstances that we would often be greeted with, but yet we would try to establish what Henry has already pointed out as fair estate planning. Sometimes there can be an element of estate planning as well as business succession plan, all in one ball of wax. So usually that would involve establishing who are the eligible owners in the business if an owner would untimely pass, and establishing who would have eligibility. Well, I would also refer back to what Henry was mentioning, who should be advanced by their acumen or by their intelligence and by their diligence of the next generation. Who should actually have a vote in the business to control the determination of a business's direction, as opposed to merely being a passive or non-active equity holder in a family business. So it would be very common for families to have two different ways of having ownership. One being in the sense of having a voice and a vote and a seat at the table to make a decision, versus a family member who perhaps is not even an adult yet. It could be a child, it could be a person with diminished capacity, and they would merely have equity, and that equity would be payable on distributions for things like taxes or when there's an extraordinary profit, but they wouldn't even have a say in when that distribution would occur. So to keep a business sustainable, even in a crisis, Also, as Henry pointed out, that is more than just tax planning. Although tax planning and tax efficiency is definitely an important thing, keeping a business sustainable, even through multiple crises, is more than just being able to be nimble and reacting on your feet. It's about having a plan in place for specific types of catastrophes, like, for example, if the primary manager or primary owner was to be disabled, incapacitated, or deceased, what would be the way you would operate on day 2 after that event? How would you get through that specific catastrophe? That is something that, in my view, every small business should have that kind of plan of at least things like, these are all of our advisors, this is where our accounts are, this is the list of important names and numbers, how to get to the different accounts and how to reach them. You'd also want to have some method or mechanism in place for what happens if the bank cuts off your line of credit. What if you suddenly have no ability to exceed what you already have in the bank? And in the context of legal concerns, I would be very careful with clients who are at the border of insolvency, that they are perhaps going to be unable to pay their bills as they come due, which is the technical definition of insolvency. Because once you reach insolvency, then you are potentially at risk with all of your partners that would be owed money, anyone who is a creditor, anyone who has a deposit paid but not yet an order delivered, employees who have already worked but not received a paycheck for that work. Those creditors or existing creditors are potentially your adversaries if you would be deepening the insolvency that you are already in. And so if you have already come to the cusp of being unable to pay your bills as they come due, then you need to very quickly evaluate what are the circumstances to get out of that insolvency, what could be the sources of other financing, a bridge loan, a white knight that could potentially bail you out of the immediate need. How can you renew that line of credit? What different banks could you talk to get different financing or to extend the terms of payment on existing obligations so that you do not get at risk of what is the tort of deepening insolvency? Because I've frequently seen that in family businesses, that because they are a family, they do not think in a way that would be, I'm just jumping this ship and trying to swim away. As managers who are merely professional managers and not related to the other family members might have the inclination to do. They might just jump ship and go work for someone else. But in a family business, there's a much greater risk of the captain or the captain family going down with the ship. And if that would happen, as an attorney, what I would first be looking at is, in addition to those obvious business obligations and debts, is what would be the family members who have personally guaranteed the business debts. Because very often it's the principals of the business that have guaranteed the loans, have guaranteed the rent payments, or otherwise guaranteed obligations of the business. And so you can be compounding a business failure with then having the need to either have a family individual bankruptcy or some type of family catastrophe financially beyond or outside the business. So in a family business, those are acutely at risk. Or when insolvency is impending, that it becomes much bigger than just that business failure. But I digress, sorry.
So, one of the reasons that I came back to Brubacher was because of the way that Keith did treat the succession plan and was open about it to me and was very honest. And it made me feel secure and also my family secure. The last place I was at, I would say, was very entitlement, and the next generation was going to take over, but they weren't prepared for the task at hand. And I didn't see a future there. So,
well, that's a really good point, Chris, that when you do your family work, the non-family people are watching, and you're sending them a powerful message that people get promoted because they're good, not because their last name is Brubacher.
Yeah.
Because you're not going to stay if you don't have opportunity, and the family trumps you all the time.
Yeah, and it's very important I think that's one of the big things is the opportunity in an organization for people too.
So with many family businesses seeing the increase in their equity and the increase in their family wealth, these are great things to happen, but they also can create many planning hurdles and additional challenges. And if anything, those are the people who need additional advice, whether from accountants or tax planners or wealth advisors or attorneys or counselors, even more, because success brings complexity, and complexity requires introspection, deliberation, and understanding of the options in that circumstance. So very often, I'm talking to people who have the very best problems you could face, problems of too much wealth, the problems of how to distribute that wealth, the problems of what areas to grow and which things to nurture. Because even when there is excess, that excess, particularly when it's done in the context of family, as has already been mentioned, there's very keen awareness in families about fairness, particularly at a single generation level. And so looking to fairness in the context of potential excess or extra usually requires planning around shuttling that wealth to the next generation in a tax-advantaged way. Because if it is not done in a tax-advantaged way, then the consequences of inheritance tax, of federal estate tax, of income tax, and capital gains can be considerable. So some of the ways that we would deal with those wonderful problems to have would be using instruments such as trusts to shift family business ownership out of the individual ownership and into a trust, or to shift ownership by transfer over a period of years in a note buyout so that the family member who is rising into the business and rising into ownership would acquire that interest at a purchase price that is determined today, in order to set that price as low as possible, expecting that the business will grow, but will pay that price over a period of years through a promissory note that could extend 10, 15 years or even longer. And so in that way, you're allowing someone to already step fully into equity ownership to whatever level the transfer is at, but that the price is at a fixed level that won't continue to rise even as the business value would rise. Some of the other problems of success would be the problems of having additional members in your family. You now have not only the generation currently in ownership, but they now have children of their own. They may have spouses coming into the family through marriage. But the ownership of new members in the family, that is, should often be measured by what Henry has already mentioned, as you want to have eligible owners owning those interests, and not simply whoever happens to be part of the family. So particularly if they're supposed to exercise a voice, a vote, and have control at the table, you want them to have some standards for what they should step into in order to actually get ownership, whether that's achieving outside experience, whether that's reaching a certain level of education, whether that's reaching a certain level of promotion or management within the company, but having those kind of reins or those parameters to make sure that the next generation actually is eligible to be a voting owner of the business. Further problems of success, I would say, are often the problems that are encountered by anyone who has high net worth, and that is how many places do you have homes? How do you give your wealth away? Is it given away during your lifetime or all at your death? Do you consider charity, church, or community obligations? Do you have other interests aside from just your family business that you also want to extend to perhaps endowing a seat at your alma mater's library, or having a fundraising campaign for a local charity that you would chair? And then how do you divide your time? Because of all the things that we have, the thing that is most finite is our time.
Thank you very much, Peter.
I would add one more to the list, and that is addiction.
Oh, yes. Very true.
Wealth fuels addiction, and it's very common among families of wealth. So that's pretty important to think about.
Yes.
Well, Chris, I'd like to just share a little bit about our 4 principles for healthy intergenerational transitions. Number one is all family members count. Sometimes succession planning is done with the attorney in a back office and then it's announced. Now, that doesn't happen so much anymore, I hope. But the whole family must be involved in this, and they must be educated. And that needs to start 10 or 15 years earlier. And I think a family business forum, not ours or someone else's, they're all across the country, to help family members understand that this is pretty complicated stuff that can be a great asset to the family, but it can be really an albatross if not. So we involve typically the spouses, and they initially say, "Oh, we don't know anything about business." Well, they do know about their kids, and they are very interested in the future of their kids. So anyway, that's a little bit of unique thing that we do that many others don't do in advising families. The second thing is obvious. The senior generation controls and decides, okay, but they really shouldn't engineer it. We believe that the rising generation needs to step up and make a proposal about the succession process. In other words, if you're going to buy a house, you ought to do due diligence on a house, right? If you're going to buy a business, I mean, you should really feel some risk. Mm-hmm. And I don't think it should be easy. It wasn't easy to start my business. Now, my family was helpful to me. My mom took care of the book table at our first event. I don't know if you were there at our first event, Keith, but my dad was delivering stuff. And so most businesses are started by families, particularly immigrant families. They can't get the money from banks, so they get it from other immigrants who have cash. So it's a family affair all the way through, and it should never stop. So the rising generation, if they can't develop a thoughtful succession plan with the help of appropriate advisors, they shouldn't be owners. And if it's boring to them, they shouldn't be owners. I mean, they should be invested in it. And I think trusts are really tricky. The irony of trusts is that we create trust because we don't trust people. And I think if you're going to be an owner, you need to be trustworthy and earn it and exercise the authority of being an owner. So that's another whole story. But then collaborative professional counsel. And I think that should be provided to the rising generation to work independent of the seniors. Like if you have 3 or 4 siblings, get together and say, do I want to be an owner with you? Let's talk about it. It shouldn't be after you sign up and you already are an owner. We have a client in another state where the father for years tried to figure out his succession plan with his accountant, and his accountant wasn't even competent. And so it created a lot of work for us, which we don't like. We don't like mediating family conflicts and tensions, and now we'll do it. And in this case, it's turned out very well, but there's still family scars. But we all learn from our scars. So,
yeah, well, that's a great reminder, Henry. I really appreciate that. I think I learned a few new things today from both you and Peter, and some reminders on some things that we did well and why they worked, and some things that we can do better as we have opportunity in the future. And I made a few notes here of things that I thought I was pretty well versed in the things that I hear from the Delaware Valley Family Business Center, and I am. But I got a few new nuggets here, and appreciate that summary.
I grew up in a third-generation family business. The expectation was that I was going to be in the business. There were 3 boys. 3 oldest were boys. The youngest was a girl. The expectation was that the girl was not going to be in the family business. My 2 oldest brothers followed the expectation. And then I came along, and I didn't want to limit myself to kind of watching the rear ends of my brothers and my dad, because I knew I would be following them. And I just knew that there was something else beyond that. So with the help of an uncle and some good teachers in my high school, they broadened my view, and I went to college, and I won't talk about a lot of other stuff that I did, but I really think I've had a good life, and I appreciate my family. I appreciate the family business, but this aversion to higher education and outside experience came back to bite them, because they grew the company. I mean, because they worked hard, they're smart, and they grew the company beyond their competence to manage it and own it. So in the 5th generation, the kids said, we can't handle this. So they had to sell it. Then they ESOP'd it. They handled it very well. And I think it has a really good outcome. And several of the family members still work in the business and are doing well. But it's no longer a family business. But my grandfather and grandmother, who were the founders, I think would be very proud of what happened. So that's good.
And what was that business? Or what?
It's a mechanical contracting, plumbing, heating, air conditioning, fuel oil.
Yes.
I mean, that's where I grew up, and we did not have strategic plans. We just were working hard, taking care of customers. I mean, you build businesses by listening to the voice of the customer. So if you do that, you can't screw it up.
And I think that's one thing that's very fascinating that maybe behind the scenes people don't see, but business is still going on. You're still servicing your customers, taking care of that, and this is another thing that you're doing behind the scenes.
Yeah, well, it's a big thing, and the business is a barking dog. It's demanding, and this planning stuff is, it's out there, and we'll get to it. We'll get around to it. Well, many people don't get around to it. So the people there was a guy who called me very, very recently last week. He's 55, and he said, he's really done well as a 2nd-generation leader. And he said, I've got 2 sons. I need help to think about how to work with that. Mm-hmm. Now, those are the people that are going to have multi-generational companies.
Yeah. But you're right, Henry. It is something else to think about that your non-family business competitors who are not dealing with that, they're not burdened by that.
That's right.
And not that it's always a burden, but just it's one more thing. So you got to be better in a lot of other ways to offset the fact that you got this other thing you got to manage.
That's exactly right.
And that, can be offset by things like patient capital. You're not worried about next quarter results because you're managing for the long run, attentiveness to culture and value of people. And there's a lot of great advantages in family business, but there is that extra weight that you got to be better than in order to overcome. Because your competitor down the street is just, how do I do the best for right now, or a publicly traded company? They're not worrying about that. So you got to be better. But there's great people that we're happy to be involved with that help us work at that.
Well, the marketplace is ruthless. The marketplace will tell the truth about whether you're performing or not, and they don't care whether you're family or not. They want to know whether you're doing a good job. So really, family firms can be better, and usually are better. And attract, I think, some of the best talent.
But it's not automatic.
But it is
takes
not
investment,
automatic.
It takes humility and a lot of hard work.
Everybody has to be learning and curious all the time.
So with this Brubacher and Beyond podcast, I just wanted to thank Henry and Peter for their time today, talking about this matter about family businesses. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Brubacher podcast today. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to our podcast so you can listen to the new episodes each month. Share it with your friends in the industry and those who might like to learn more about the construction industry. Feel free to check out our website at www.brubacher.net. I'm Keith Brubacher, president of Brubacher Excavating Incorporated, and we hope you found our discussion insightful, and we look forward to the next time together.